Imagine being stranded on a frozen continent where temperatures plunge below -40 degrees Celsius, your ship crushed by ice and the nearest rescue thousands of miles away. How could anyone possibly survive? Today, we uncover the extraordinary story of Ernest Shackleton and his crewmen who defied death in the most unforgiving place on Earth. The problem we're resolving is this: how did they endure the impossible when survival seemed hopeless? Introduce Ernest Shackleton's 1914 Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, explain the ambitious goal of crossing Antarctica, and then set the stage for the disaster, their ship, Endurance, becoming trapped and ultimately destroyed by ice. Promise viewers that the episode will reveal not just what happened, but how Shackleton's leadership and the crew's resilience turned certain death into one of the greatest survival stories in history. In the early years of the 20th century, the world still had blank spaces on its maps. The Arctic and Antarctic were the last great frontiers, icy realms of mystery that called out to men who longed for glory. Among these men stood one of the most daring explorers of all time, Sir Ernest Shackleton. Born in Ireland and raised with a thirst for adventure, Shackleton was no stranger to the dangers of polar exploration. He had already sailed with Robert Falcon Scott to Antarctica and even led his own expedition in 1907, coming within just 100 miles of the South Pole before being forced back. Yet despite these trials, his ambition burned brighter than ever. Shackleton was a man who could not accept unfinished business. By 1914, the so-called heroic age of Antarctic exploration was in full swing. The race to the South Pole had already been won by Roald Amundsen of Norway in 1911, leaving little room for Shackleton to carve his name into history with a similar achievement. Shackleton, however, saw a new challenge, an even greater test of endurance and human willpower. He dreamed of being the first to cross the entire Antarctic continent, from one coast to the other, an epic journey of nearly 2,000 miles across some of the harshest terrain on Earth. It would not simply be an expedition of discovery, but a conquest of the last untouched frontier. Shackleton was a master of vision and persuasion. He knew how to inspire men, how to make them believe in something larger than themselves. Legend has it that he placed an advertisement in the newspapers calling for volunteers, though historians debate whether the ad ever truly existed. It supposedly read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in case of success." Whether or not these words ever appeared in print, they captured the essence of what Shackleton offered, a chance to achieve immortality through suffering, hardship, and triumph, and men came forward. They were sailors, scientists, carpenters, engineers, men of every background, united by a hunger for adventure and glory. Shackleton selected a crew of 27 to join him aboard a ship aptly named Endurance. It was not just a vessel of wood and steel. It was a symbol of their collective resolve. Built in Norway, the Endurance was designed to withstand the crushing pressures of pack ice, with reinforced oak timbers and a powerful engine. Yet no ship, no matter how sturdy, could guarantee safety in the treacherous, ice-choked waters of the Weddell Sea. Shackleton's plan was ambitious. He would sail from South Georgia Island into the Weddell Sea, land a team on the Antarctic coast, and then lead them on a march across the continent, all the way to the Ross Sea on the far side. Meanwhile, another party would sail to the Ross Sea and lay supply depots along the way to ensure Shackleton's crossing party had food and fuel for their journey. It was a plan that required perfect timing, flawless execution, and the cooperation of men separated by thousands of miles. But Shackleton believed it could be done, and his confidence was infectious. As Europe drifted toward the chaos of World War I in 1914, Shackleton pressed ahead with his expedition. In fact, when war broke out just before their departure, Shackleton offered his ship and crew to the British government. Astonishingly, Winston Churchill himself, then First Lord of the Admiralty, sent a message back telling Shackleton to proceed with his mission. It was as if fate had cleared the way for him to attempt this unprecedented conquest. The Endurance sailed south, carrying not just men and supplies, but also the weight of Shackleton's dreams. The crew were eager, their spirits high, their faith in their leader absolute. Many of them had never seen ice before, never endured the deadly cold winds that sweep across Antarctica, never faced the endless nights of polar darkness. But they trusted Shackleton, and Shackleton trusted himself. His very presence seemed to promise survival, no matter the odds. To Shackleton, this was more than just an expedition. It was his chance to etch his name into the annals of exploration, alongside the greats who had come before. He envisioned a triumph that would silence his critics, elevate him above rivals, and prove that the age of polar discovery was not yet over. He would be the man who crossed Antarctica, not for wealth, not for conquest in the traditional sense, but for the sheer challenge of the impossible. The world looked on with anticipation. Newspapers followed the story with fascination, describing Shackleton as a modern hero embarking on an epic quest. He was not merely chasing adventure. He was pursuing immortality. And as the Endurance cut through the waters of the Southern Ocean, bound for the icy heart of the Weddell Sea, it seemed that nothing could stand in his way. But the dream of conquest carried within it the seeds of nightmare. The very ice that Shackleton sought to conquer was already stirring, waiting, ready to test him and his men in ways they could scarcely imagine. For while Shackleton believed he was chasing glory, Antarctica had other plans. The Weddell Sea is no ordinary stretch of ocean. It is a place where ice reigns supreme, a frozen labyrinth that shifts, groans, and crushes anything caught in its grasp. For Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance, it was the first true test of their resolve. At first, the journey southward felt promising. The ship cut steadily through cold waters, her men marveling at the vast wilderness around them. Penguins darted through the waves, seals lounged on drifting floes, and the great albatross soared overhead. Spirits were high, for though the cold bit deep, they were explorers on the cusp of history. Yet nature, as it so often does, had other plans. By January 1915, the Endurance reached the outer reaches of the Weddell Sea, and almost immediately, trouble began. The sea ice was thicker than anticipated. Sheets of frozen ocean, miles across, blocked their path, forcing Shackleton to maneuver constantly. The crew worked tirelessly, chipping away at the ice, guiding the vessel through narrow leads of open water, but the gaps grew narrower each day. As the austral summer waned, the sea closed in around them like a tightening fist. Each crack of ice, each groan of the ship's wooden timbers, was a warning that they had entered a realm where human will counted for little. Still, Shackleton pressed onward, determined to reach the Antarctic coast and begin the march. He believed that persistence could bend fortune, that leadership and resolve could overcome even the might of nature, but the Weddell Sea is merciless. On January 18, 1915, the inevitable happened. The Endurance became trapped, gripped firmly by the pack ice. At first, the men assumed this would be temporary. Ships before them had been stuck for days, even weeks, only to be freed when shifting winds opened new channels. They laughed off the danger, treating it as an inconvenience. The Endurance, after all, was built to withstand ice. Her hull was strong, her timbers reinforced, her spirit as resilient as the men aboard her. Shackleton encouraged this optimism, insisting they would soon be on their way. But days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. The ice showed no mercy. Instead of loosening, it thickened around the ship, pressing in with a force no timber could resist forever. The crew could hear it at night, the groaning, cracking, and grinding of a frozen world alive with movement. The ship shuddered under the pressure, her beams bending, her seams creaking, as though the sea itself were determined to swallow her whole. The men began to realize that they were not simply delayed, they were prisoners. Life aboard a trapped ship demanded patience, discipline, and above all, Shackleton's unyielding leadership. He knew the dangers of despair and idleness. To keep his men sharp, he enforced routines. Meals were shared together, games of football were played on the ice, and even the ship's carpenter, Harry McNish, kept busy making repairs and improvements. Shackleton encouraged humor, organized sled dog races, and reminded his men daily that their survival depended on unity. Outwardly, he projected confidence, but inwardly, he understood the grim reality. Each day, the ice carried them farther from their intended course, drifting north with the frozen sea. The dream of crossing Antarctica was slipping away. As the months wore on, the strain grew heavier. Supplies remained adequate, but the isolation gnawed at the crew. They lived in a world of endless white, where the sun barely rose in winter and temperatures plunged to unimaginable lows. Shackleton walked the decks often, speaking to each man, boosting morale, watching carefully for signs of mutiny or despair. He knew that in these conditions, leadership was not about glory, it was about survival. By September 1915, the ice began to exert its final judgment. Pressure ridges rose around the Endurance, jagged walls of ice that thrust upward as floes collided. The ship groaned under forces no vessel was ever meant to endure. The men hacked at the ice with picks, trying to relieve the pressure, but it was useless. Shackleton ordered them to save what supplies they could, knowing the ship's days were numbered. And then came the moment no explorer ever wishes to face. The ice tore into the hull, water poured in, and the Endurance began to die. The crew watched in silence as the ship that had carried their hopes and dreams groaned, splintered, and gave way. Shackleton, standing firm as ever, gave the order to abandon ship. Everything they had prepared for the journey across the continent, the grand conquest, was gone. Now there was only one mission left: survival. With sledges, lifeboats, food, and whatever supplies they could salvage, the men set up camp on the ice itself. Around them stretched a desolate landscape with no landmarks, no hope of rescue, and no guarantee that the ice would even hold beneath their feet. They were at the mercy of drifting floes, their only chance to endure the shifting moods of a frozen ocean that seemed intent on destroying them. Shackleton gathered his men and reminded them of one thing: no matter what happened, he would not let a single life be lost. Leadership in times of triumph is simple, but true leadership is revealed in the face of chaos. Shackleton's greatness was not measured by reaching the South Pole or by planting flags in distant lands. It was measured here, in the frozen prison of the Weddell Sea, where his ship lay shattered and his men stranded on drifting ice with no hope of immediate rescue. At that moment, he faced a reality no leader dreams of. The grand expedition he had envisioned, the conquest of Antarctica, was gone. All that remained was survival, and every decision he made from that point on would mean the difference between life and death for his crew. When the Endurance finally succumbed to the crushing ice and disappeared beneath the surface in November 1915, the men stood silent. For a moment, it felt as though their last tie to the world had been severed. The ship had not just been a vessel. It had been their home, their symbol of safety, their last defense against the wilderness. Now it was gone. Shackleton, however, wasted no time mourning. He turned immediately to his men and reminded them of a new goal. "Ship and stores have gone," he said, "but we have our lives. I will see you safe home." In that simple promise lay the essence of his leadership, absolute determination to bring every man back alive. What set Shackleton apart was his ability to manage not only the practical necessities of survival, but also the psychological well-being of his men. He knew that despair could kill faster than cold or hunger. So he created purpose where there was none. He organized duties, giving each man a role. Even in the bleakness of the ice, he insisted on maintaining routines, meals served at regular hours, watches kept, and small comforts preserved. He encouraged humor, allowing the men to joke about their misfortune, to mock the ice, and to play cards in their makeshift camps. To outsiders, it might seem trivial, but Shackleton understood that laughter was as vital as food. He also paid close attention to the personalities within his group. Shackleton had an instinct for reading men, and he knew who might falter, who might sow dissent, and who could be relied upon to lift others' spirits. He often placed the most troublesome individuals closest to himself, keeping them under his watch and channeling their energy into constructive tasks. He kept the optimists spread among the men, ensuring that hope was never concentrated in one corner, but shared like warmth across the camp. It was not strategy written in books, but born of instinct, and it kept his men united even when everything around them seemed to be falling apart. The conditions they faced were brutal beyond comprehension. The ice beneath them was never still. It cracked, shifted, and split open with thunderous roars, threatening to swallow their camp whole. The men were forced to move repeatedly, hauling their supplies and lifeboats across treacherous floes. Temperatures dropped so low that even their clothing froze stiff and the constant winds cut through fur and fabric alike. They lived among the howling of dogs, the endless groaning of the ice, and the gnawing hunger that grew sharper with each passing week. Shackleton knew that in such a world, authority could not be distant or aloof. He was always present, sharing the same rations, enduring the same hardships, never taking more than his men. This fairness inspired loyalty, and loyalty gave them the strength to endure. Food was a constant concern. With their provisions dwindling, Shackleton made the difficult choice to slaughter the sled dogs. Beloved companions that had once been their link to exploration. The meat provided sustenance, but it also broke hearts. Shackleton understood this and carried the burden of the decision himself, framing it not as cruelty, but as necessity. He reminded his men that survival demanded sacrifice and that every life saved was a step closer to home. His ability to balance compassion with pragmatism was the mark of a leader who knew when to be stern and when to be gentle. As months dragged on, some men began to question whether rescue would ever come. Mutiny was a threat that lurked quietly in the background, especially from strong-willed individuals like the carpenter Harry McNish. McNish openly challenged Shackleton's authority at times, frustrated with the seeming futility of their struggle. Shackleton, however, responded not with violence or rage, but with firm control. He made it clear that dissent would not be tolerated, yet he also recognized McNish's value and found ways to keep him engaged, using his skills when they became essential. By striking this balance between discipline and respect, Shackleton maintained order without breaking the spirit of his crew. Each decision he made was guided by one unshakable principle: every life mattered. Unlike other expeditions where leaders might sacrifice men for the sake of glory, Shackleton refused to accept such a cost. His goal was no longer exploration, it was survival. This clarity of purpose became his greatest strength. His men followed him not because he held rank, but because he earned their trust every single day. As the ice drifted northward, carrying the men farther from their intended path, Shackleton prepared them for what lay ahead. He reminded them constantly that they were moving toward open water, and open water meant the possibility of escape. Even when conditions seemed hopeless, he painted a vision of survival, a future where they would reach land in safety. In doing so, he gave his men a reason to rise each morning and face another day on the endless ice. Shackleton's leadership during these dark months was not about bold speeches or dramatic gestures. It was about the steady hand, the calm presence, the unwavering belief that they would endure. He understood the power of hope, and he wielded it as carefully as any tool or weapon. In the chaos of the Antarctic, Shackleton became the anchor, holding his crew together while the world around them threatened to break them apart. Life on the ice was unlike anything the men of the Endurance had ever known. When their ship was swallowed by the sea, they were left marooned on a shifting world of frozen water, a place that was neither land nor sea, but a vast expanse of drifting floes. Around them stretched a white horizon in every direction, broken only by jagged ridges of ice rising like walls from the frozen ocean. Above, the sky alternated between endless gray and piercing blue, but beneath it all was the same relentless cold, a cold that clung to their bones and froze the very breath from their lungs. This was not merely survival against hunger or thirst. It was a battle against an entire environment designed to erase human life. The men set up camp, dragging their salvaged supplies and 3 lifeboats onto the ice. Their tents were little more than thin barriers against the screaming winds, patched and repatched with whatever scraps they had saved. Inside, they huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets, sharing breath, knowing that even a small tear in their fragile shelters could mean frostbite or worse. They named their first encampment Ocean Camp, a bitter irony given that they were stranded on frozen sea, not solid ground. Here, every sound was magnified in the silence, the crack of shifting ice beneath them, the groans of distant floes colliding, the restless barking of the few remaining dogs, and the hollow rumble of stomachs never quite full. Food was a constant struggle. They lived on salvaged rations, biscuits, tinned meat, and whatever they could hunt on the ice. Seals provided both meat and vital blubber for fuel, while penguins became another staple in their strange polar diet. Shackleton, ever mindful of morale, insisted that meals be shared as communally as possible. He knew that eating together reminded the men that they were not alone, that they were a team. He also understood that small luxuries, such as hot milk or a carefully saved piece of chocolate, could lift spirits as much as a feast. Each bite mattered, not only to the body but to the mind. The daily routine became their lifeline. Shackleton understood that structure gave purpose, so mornings began with chores, cleaning, and caring for supplies. Hunting parties ventured out to track seals, while others gathered ice for melting water or repaired the precious lifeboats that would one day be their salvation. Afternoons might bring games, improvised soccer matches played on the frozen surface, laughter echoing strangely across the desolation. These games were not simply diversions. They were survival in another form, a reminder of humanity in a place designed to strip it away. Yet for all the order Shackleton tried to impose, the ice was an unpredictable enemy. At times the floes drifted together, creating pressure ridges that rose like frozen mountains. At other times, cracks would split open beneath their feet without warning, threatening to swallow tents, stores, or even men whole. There were nights when the thunderous roar of ice breaking apart jolted them from sleep, forcing them to scramble in darkness to move their camp to safer ground. On one occasion, a man fell into a crack, saved only by the quick reflexes of his comrades. These near misses were constant reminders that they lived on borrowed time, their very foundation capable of vanishing in an instant. Darkness added another layer of despair. The Antarctic winter brought long months where the sun barely lifted above the horizon, casting the ice in eerie twilight or plunging it into near-total blackness. Time lost meaning, days blurring together in a cycle of cold and hunger. The men relied on watches to mark the hours, but the endless night weighed heavily on them. Sleep became restless, haunted by dreams of warmth, home, and food. Depression lurked at the edges of the camp, threatening to take hold. Shackleton fought it relentlessly by keeping the men busy, keeping their minds occupied, never allowing despair to root itself too deeply. There were moments of odd beauty, too, moments when the desolation revealed its majesty. The aurora australis, the southern lights, would sometimes ripple across the sky in waves of green and purple, reminding the men of the world's vastness and their own small place within it. Penguins waddled into camp, curious and unafraid, their antics briefly lifting spirits. Even the ice itself, shimmering in moonlight or glowing under a rare burst of sun, became something more than an enemy. It was a cathedral of nature, magnificent and terrible at once. The men clung to one another, not just for warmth, but for sanity. Friendships deepened in the endless cold, bonds forged by shared suffering. They told stories to pass the time, recited poems, sang songs, anything to keep the mind alive. Some kept journals, filling page after page with thoughts, sketches, and memories, perhaps believing that if they did not survive, their words might. Shackleton encouraged these acts of expression, understanding that the mind needed nourishment as much as the body. But beneath the surface of this fragile order lay an ever-growing urgency. Supplies were dwindling faster than they could be replaced. Hunting could not provide everything. The ice drifted unpredictably, carrying them farther and farther from where they had hoped to be. Shackleton knew they could not stay on the floes forever. Each crack, each groan of the shifting sea was a warning. Eventually, the ice would betray them completely, and when that day came, they would have to take to the boats. He began preparing quietly, ensuring the lifeboats were ready and shoring. His men were prepared for the moment when they would leave their frozen camp behind and cast themselves into the stormy, unforgiving sea. When Shackleton finally gave the order to abandon the ice, it was not a choice made lightly. They had lived on drifting floes for months, always knowing that one day the ice would betray them. That day came in April 1916, when the frozen sea around their camp began to break apart in violent crashes, opening black pools of water that threatened to swallow men and supplies alike. Shackleton's only option now was to trust the 3 lifeboats they had salvaged from the Endurance, fragile wooden vessels that would be their salvation or their grave. The boats were christened the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Shackleton divided his 28 men among them, packing in supplies, sledges, and what little remained of their strength. The order to launch was given, and the men pushed the boats into the icy water, clambering aboard as the floes split behind them. Almost immediately, they were plunged into a new kind of nightmare. The Southern Ocean is one of the most violent stretches of water on Earth, and in April, it was a world of endless gales, monstrous waves, and freezing spray that turned to ice the moment it touched skin. The journey was not simply dangerous, it was chaos given form. The boats rose and fell on towering swells, their fragile hulls creaking as if they would splinter with each crash. Men bailed water constantly, their hands numb and bleeding, their bodies soaked in freezing spray. Frostbitten fingers clung to oars, while others huddled together for warmth, teeth chattering uncontrollably. Sleep was impossible, food scarce, and thirst a constant torment. They carried only limited rations, and though they melted ice for drinking water, the salt spray often made it brackish and undrinkable. Every man knew that if they capsized, the icy water would kill them within minutes. Yet still, they rowed, they endured, they clung to life. Their goal was Elephant Island, a desolate outcrop of rock and ice more than 100 miles away. It was no paradise, it offered no rescue, no inhabitants, no real shelter. But it was land, and after months on ice and water, land itself had become salvation. Shackleton kept his men focused on this promise, reminding them that once they reached solid ground, they could regroup and plan their next move. He spoke little of the dangers, though each man could see them with his own eyes, the endless horizon of stormy sea, the ever-present threat of capsizing, the gnawing hunger that turned each day into torment. For a week they fought the ocean, clinging to life in boats never meant for such a journey. Exhaustion hung over them like a fog, but Shackleton never allowed despair to take hold. He moved between the boats, shouting encouragement, urging his men to keep rowing, to keep bailing, to keep going. His presence was like an anchor, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Shackleton's resolve convinced them they would survive. He even rationed hope as carefully as he rationed food, never promising more than what was possible, but never allowing the thought of failure to take root. At last, on April 15, 1916, they sighted Elephant Island. The men erupted in cheers, their frozen faces breaking into smiles for the first time in weeks. The island loomed as a jagged fortress of rock and snow, battered by waves and wind, but to them it was a beacon of survival. Reaching it, however, was not easy. The shoreline was brutal, with crashing surf that threatened to smash their boats to splinters against the rocks. Shackleton circled the island, searching desperately for a safe landing. Finally, after days of searching and several failed attempts, they found a narrow beach where they could haul the boats ashore. Men stumbled onto land, collapsing in exhaustion, kissing the ground, some too weak to even stand. For the first time in nearly 500 days, they were on firm land, but it was only the beginning of another ordeal. Elephant Island offered safety from the drifting ice, but it was no true refuge. There was no chance of rescue here. No ship passed this desolate place. Shackleton knew that if they remained, they would simply starve and freeze. Something had to be done, and once again, the burden of decision fell squarely on his shoulders. He studied the maps, limited as they were, and realized that their only hope lay in an impossible gamble. South Georgia Island, the whaling station where they had begun their journey, was nearly 800 miles away across the stormiest seas in the world. To attempt such a voyage in a small open boat bordered on madness, but to Shackleton it was the only chance. He selected the sturdiest of the lifeboats, the James Caird, and ordered the carpenter McNish to reinforce it with wood and canvas. The little boat was modified into something that might withstand the open ocean, though it was far from seaworthy by any normal standard. Shackleton chose 5 men to accompany him: Frank Worsley, his brilliant navigator; Tom Crean, the indomitable Irishman; McNish, the reluctant carpenter whose skills were indispensable; John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy. The rest of the crew would remain behind on Elephant Island, under the command of Frank Wild, Shackleton's trusted second-in-command. Shackleton promised them he would return, and though the men knew the odds were slim, they believed him. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his chosen companions pushed the James Caird into the sea and began the most daring escape attempt in the history of exploration. Ahead lay 800 miles of frigid ocean, monstrous waves, and storms that could capsize them at any moment. Behind them lay 22 men waiting on a barren island, clinging to Shackleton's promise. The fate of every one of them now rested on whether this tiny boat, this fragile shell of wood and canvas, could make the impossible journey through the deadliest waters on Earth. The voyage of the James Caird was a gamble so audacious it bordered on madness. Shackleton and his 5 companions braved the might of the Southern Ocean for more than 2 weeks, battling waves that towered like cliffs, storms that lashed their fragile boat, and cold that threatened to freeze them where they sat. Frank Worsley, the navigator, worked tirelessly with a sextant, snatching fleeting glimpses of the sun through storm clouds to plot their course. The accuracy of his calculations meant everything 1 degree off and they would miss South Georgia entirely, lost forever in the endless ocean. Shackleton's men rowed and bailed in shifts, their bodies drenched, their faces burned raw by salt and wind. They fought to stay alive with nothing but determination and trust in their leader. At last, on May 10, 1916, the mountains of South Georgia rose on the horizon, jagged peaks piercing through the mist. They had done the impossible. Yet the island was no easy salvation. The James Caird landed on the wrong side, battered and broken, leaving them still cut off from the whaling stations by an impassable coastline. With the boat too damaged to sail further, Shackleton made another decision that tested the very limits of human endurance. He, Worsley, and Tom Crean would cross the island's unexplored mountains and glaciers on foot, without maps, without rest, and without proper equipment. The journey was 36 hours of unrelenting struggle climbing icy slopes, sliding down glaciers, traversing terrain no man had ever crossed. They carried no tents, no sleeping bags. Stopping meant freezing. Shackleton drove his companions forward relentlessly, and at times they believed a fourth presence was with them, a mysterious sense that another figure walked alongside, guiding them through the darkness. When the 3 men finally staggered into the whaling station at Storminess, their clothes in tatters, their faces gaunt and weathered, the workers scarcely recognized them as human. Shackleton wasted no time. His first words were not of triumph, but of urgency. "My men are still on Elephant Island. I must go back for them." Even in the moment of his own survival, his thoughts were only of the men he had left behind. It would take several attempts before rescue could be made. The seas were still hostile and ice repeatedly blocked the way. Months passed as Shackleton worked tirelessly to secure ships and support, his determination never faltering. Finally, on August 30, 1916, Shackleton returned to Elephant Island aboard a Chilean vessel, the Elcho, as the fog lifted. The stranded men rushed to the shore, scanning the horizon, and when they saw Shackleton's ship, they erupted with joy. Every man had survived. Against all odds, not a single life was lost. The world was stunned by the story. In an age when polar expeditions often ended in tragedy, Shackleton's achievement was unprecedented. He had not crossed Antarctica as he intended, but he had accomplished something greater. He had brought his entire crew home alive. Newspapers heralded him as a hero, though Shackleton himself downplayed the praise. He did not see himself as extraordinary. To him, he had done only what was necessary as a leader, to safeguard his men, no matter the cost. The legacy of Shackleton's endurance expedition did not lie in discoveries or territorial claims. It lay in the example it set for what human beings are capable of in the face of overwhelming odds. Shackleton's story became a timeless lesson in leadership, resilience, and unity. Historians, adventurers, and military leaders alike studied his methods, recognizing the subtle genius in how he kept his men alive. He had balanced discipline with compassion, authority with humility, and practicality with hope. His ability to inspire loyalty and maintain morale in the harshest conditions remains unmatched. The story of the Endurance has been retold countless times in books, lectures, and films, each generation finding new meaning in it. For explorers, it is a testament to courage. For leaders, it is a masterclass in responsibility and vision. For ordinary people, it is proof that even in the most desperate circumstances, the human spirit can endure. Shackleton himself would embark on further expeditions, unable to resist the call of the polar regions, though none would match the drama of the Endurance. In 1922, he died of a heart attack during another Antarctic voyage, his body laid to rest on South Georgia, the island that had once been his salvation. Even in death, he remained bound to the polar landscapes that had defined his life. Decades later, in 2022, the world once again turned its gaze to the Weddell Sea when explorers discovered the wreck of the Endurance, lying 2 miles beneath the surface, preserved in the icy waters. Images of the ship, still bearing her name across the stern, stirred emotions across the globe. More than a century after Shackleton's ordeal, the Endurance had been found, her story etched not only into history, but into the very ice that had claimed her. It was a reminder that the past still speaks, and that Shackleton's legacy continues to inspire all who hear it. The mystery of Shackleton's Endurance is not in how the ship was crushed or how the men suffered. It is in how they survived when every force of nature conspired against them. It is the mystery of human endurance, of willpower stronger than ice, of leadership that turned disaster into triumph. Shackleton and his men proved that survival is not just about strength of body, but strength of spirit, the ability to hold fast when everything else breaks. From the moment Shackleton set sail with his dream of conquering Antarctica, to the crushing of the Endurance in the merciless grip of the Weddell Sea, his story was never just about exploration. It was about resilience, about the human spirit refusing to bow before impossible odds. On drifting ice floes, in lifeboats tossed across the most dangerous seas and over mountains no man had ever crossed, Shackleton and his crew faced death at every turn. Yet what kept them alive was not luck alone. It was leadership, trust, and an unbreakable bond between men who refused to leave one another behind. The survival of all 28 crew members stands as one of the greatest triumphs in human history, not because they reached their original goal, but because they achieved something far greater. Shackleton proved that true conquest lies not in planting flags or claiming land, but in preserving life, in enduring together against the darkness. His legacy lives on not in the maps of Antarctica, but in the countless leaders, adventurers, who draw strength from his story. The wreck of the Endurance, found a century later beneath the frozen sea, is not just a relic of a lost expedition. It is a symbol, a reminder that when all seems lost, when ice crushes the ship of your ambitions, survival depends not only on courage, but on hope that never breaks. Shackleton's journey is not just history. It is a lesson for all time.